Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and it is Sunday, so we are doing breaches of the week. And as always, I'd like to start by thanking the following people that sent me a ton of information. It always helps me out. We've got some really interesting and just crazy companies caught up in breaches this week. So thank you very much, Chris Fallon, Jason Dance, Barrett Peterson, and Richard Reefer. I thank you so very much. And with that, let's start with financial giant Morgan Stanley, because Morgan Stanley Wealth Management, which is the wealth and asset division of Morgan Stanley, says that some of their customers had their accounts compromised in social engineering attacks. Now, the account breaches were a result of phishing, aka voice phishing, a social engineering attack where scammers impersonate a trusted entity, in this case Morgan Stanley, during a voice call to convince their targets into revealing or handing over sensitive information, such as banking and login credentials. Now, the company said in a notice sent to affected clients that, quote, on or around February 11th, 2022, a threat actor impersonating Morgan Stanley gained access to their accounts after tricking them into providing their Morgan Stanley online account info. The Morgan Stanley division added that it disabled the accounts of all customers affected and that their systems remain secure. So heads up to you. If Morgan Stanley has contacted you and you are part of their or are a customer of their asset and wealth management side, you definitely want to check in. Moving on. Let's talk about Hubspot, because a rogue employee working at Hubspot, which is used by more than 135,000 and growing customers to manage marketing campaigns and onboard new users, all that kind of stuff. This employee has been fired over a breach that zeroed in on the company's cryptocurrency customers, and that is according to the company this past Friday, like a week ago Friday. Now, the breach basically rippled through the cryptocurrency industry, and as of last Monday, a week ago or so, crypto lending platform BlockFi, Bitcoin purchasing automation platform Swan Bitcoin, Bitcoin company NYDIG, peer-to-peer payment technology company Circle, and cryptocurrency fund Pantera Capital, which was actually hit a month prior, have all been affected. So heads up to you. If you use HubSpot, but specifically if you have anything to do with cryptocurrency and you also use HubSpot as well. Moving on, let's talk about Shutterfly. Like I said, a whole bunch of names we all know. They confirm that the social security numbers and other sensitive information of as many as 1,406 employees was compromised as a result of a ransomware attack. Now, according to official filing by the by the company, on December 13th of last year, Shutterfly learned that the company was targeted in a ransomware attack on or around December 3rd of last year as well. While the compromised information varies based on employee, it may include names, social security numbers, salary and compensation information, and information related to FMLA, that's the Family Medical Leave Act, or workers' compensation claims. So heads up to you, employees of Shutterfly. You definitely want to check in, probably past employees as well. Moving on, let's talk about Illuminate Education. This is a taxpayer-funded, excuse me, I think I'm coming down with something here. This is a taxpayer-funded software company that the New York City's Department of Education uses to track grades and attendance of students. And you know where we're going here, because an attacker gained access to students' birthdays, names, ethnicities, and English speaking, special education, and free lunch statuses. The students' social security numbers and family financial information were not collected by the Department of Education and therefore were not compromised. According to sources, we're talking about 820,000 current and former New York City public school students. So heads up to you if basically you've gone to public school in NYC. Moving on, let's talk about Creative Services out of Massachusetts. 4 parallel lawsuits filed this month accuse Creative Services, who specialize in background checks, of negligently failing to safeguard private information. And I quote, determined that certain files dating from November of 2018 to November of 2021 may have been copied from their systems as part of a cyber attack. According to these 4 lawsuits, those basically letters informing the victims were sent in February to more than 164,000 people who had their information potentially exposed by this data breach. Organizations obviously will now have to start declaring data breaches who were using Creative Services for background checks. The first one to announce was Boston University. So heads up, Boston University and the other 160-odd thousand people. If you've ever used Creative Services in your business or had a background check through them, you definitely want to check in, especially if you've had that in the last few years. Moving on. Let's head over to the state of Washington to talk about the Spokane Regional Health District, the SRHD, if you will. And they said information was accessed via a phishing email on February 24th of this year. Obviously, they were alerted, shut it down, but their internal investigation showed files with clients' protected health information might have been previewed. I say previewed by the attackers. However, the investigation did not show that any documents had been opened to access or downloaded, according to the Spokane Regional Health District. So possibly dodged a bullet there, but heads up to you, all of those members in Washington State. Moving on, let's head on over to New Jersey to talk about New Jersey Brain and Spine, or NJBS, because according to a notice that they posted on their website on November 16th of 2021, they discovered that certain types of files on their computer network had been encrypted, aka ransomware. We are talking potentially names, address, dates of birth, email addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, financial account information, debit or credit card info, driver's license info or other IDs, and medical information. So heads up to you, patients of New Jersey Brain and Spine. Moving on. Let's head on down to Texas, where the stars at night are big and bright. The Texas Department of Insurance on January 4th of this year, a security issue with their basically web application that they use to manage workers' compensation, was apparently leaking because the types of information that might have been accessible thanks to this web application, I'm assuming some kind of API, includes names, addresses, dates of birth, phone numbers, parts or all of social security numbers, and information about injuries and worker compensation claims. So heads up to you if you have anything to do with the Texas Department of Insurance. And excuse me, sticking with the Lone Star State, let's talk about Jdc Healthcare Management, which has 72 basically outfits known as Jefferson Dental and Orthodontics offices across the entire state of Texas. And I quote, on or about August 9, 2021, JDC became aware of a malware incident impacting certain company systems. We're talking social security numbers, dates of birth, driver's license numbers, health insurance information, clinical information, and financial information. So if you are a patient at one of these 72 Jefferson Dental and Orthodontics offices across the Lone Star State, heads up to you. You might want to check in. And finally, and we have two finalies for you, these are actually incredibly interesting. We've seen basically a lowering in cyber attacks worldwide thanks to the situation in Ukraine. Obviously not that ransomware gangs have stopped, but a lot of this is focused in the theater of conflict. So our first of two finalies has to do with Ukraine, and this is going to be an update on that because hacker collectives are now starting to put pressure on Western brands over their decisions to continue to operate in some way, shape, or form in the country of Russia. As you know, the world, for the most part, has banded together to level sanctions on Russia, and many different companies, some late to the game like McDonald's, but still part of it, say, yeah, we are going to basically stop operating in Russia. So McDonald's closed their 800 odd stores, and some other companies or organizations, one of them would be Papa John's, for example, basically said, no, we're going to keep our stores open. The Russians appreciate, I think this quote was, the Russians appreciate good pizza or something like that. And so Papa John's obviously finding it for whatever reason in their best interest to keep working in Russia. But today I want to talk about Nestle. This is the massive, utterly massive food brand based out of Switzerland. And here's what's going on, because following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Nestle has been under fire from their customers, environmentalists, politicians, et cetera, because they have not completely withdrawn from Russia. In a series of statements, the Swiss food giant has said that they would continue to provide Russia with vital foods such as baby formula and medical nutrition assistance, meaning they're not going to send their Nestle chocolate bars there, but babies need formula, medical nutrition, all of that. They're going to continue to do that. Now, by virtue of that, the hacker collective Anonymous has put Nestle basically on the top of their list of what they believe or consider to be outcast corporations that have done not enough or too little to distance themselves from Russia in the wake of the invasion. Now, Anonymous on one of their Twitter accounts just put out the following message. And I quote Anonymous's Twitter, just in, the Anonymous Collective has leaked the database of the largest food company in the world, Nestle, leaked 10 gigabyte data of emails, passwords, Nestle business customers, etc. They also put out screenshots of this database that they allegedly stole with a download link to it, so the world could go download all of Nestle's information. And I think that this kind of speaks to the pressure that essentially hacker collectives are putting on corporations, but also Russia as well. I've talked about this extensively on my radio show, as well as here on the podcast and daily video and all those kinds of things. And so what we are seeing is not just the anonymouses of the world hitting inside of Russia, knocking out Russian infrastructure, but they are also looking externally to say what large organizations are giving in some way, shape, or form material support to the Russian Federation. And so they are being targeted as well. We are starting to see this move from outside, basically the theater of conflict between Ukraine and Russia, meaning most of the hacking attacks that we have seen are focused on that region, basically of the world. Now we're starting to see it spread out as they are going after Western countries, or Western companies that essentially are making the decision to stay in some way, shape, or form in terms of business with Russia. So I'm wondering, as I mentioned before, Papa John's has made the decision to say, no, we're not going to close down in Russia. Will they be on the chopping block? Will others? And this is an interesting kind of pressure that we are seeing. There's a lot of pressure. So I also mentioned McDonald's, who was basically late to the game. They didn't close down for weeks after the invasion, at least a couple of weeks when everybody else was pulling out. And finally, they succumbed to that international peer pressure, if you will, and said, yes, we will do the same thing. So I'm very curious to see what's going on with this. I'm wondering who else is going to be on this target. But heads up, if you are listening to this or watching this and you work for a rather large invisible corporation that is continuing to do business in Russia, I would kind of expect the anonymouses of the world to start taking a real hard look at you as they are making their lists, and basically they're checking it twice. So heads up to you, all the corporations of the world. Now, whether you agree with this kind of peer pressure or not, okay, that's we can have a debate on that. But the fact of the matter is, whether you like it or not, it is happening. And it is happening now. So I don't think Nestle is going to be the only one that gets hit. And obviously, I will keep you up to date on all of this, as I have been for the other aspects of the Ukraine situation as it relates to cybersecurity, cyber warfare, and everything else. And the other, finally, that I want to talk about is basically the hacker group the criminal hacker group, I should say, known as Lapsus. That's LAPSUS, and then a $sign at the end. They have been rather prolific, and they have been rather new, to the point where I have been speculating, and I have not gotten confirmation on this, as this is my speculation, that they seem to me to be a reconstituted version of REvil, or REvil. If you recall, earlier this year, Russia basically arrested 16 members of the REvil or REvil gang, and they essentially dropped off the face of the earth. The United States wanted them extradited. Russia obviously didn't do that. And so the speculation is, well, they are just using the prowess and capabilities of that gang to essentially further Russia interests as they invade Ukraine, and they're using them to help launch retaliatory cyber attacks, all those kinds of things. So Lapsus has been rather spectacular in the last couple of months with high visibility hits, to the point where I'm thinking maybe it's not just REvil, maybe they're getting backing from like the Russian SFB to continue their trade. Again, speculation, they could be an entirely different group, but just everything I'm seeing, all the indicators, my gut is telling me it kind of looks the same. We'll see. I could be completely wrong, and I will be the first to tell you if I am. Now, I want to focus, though, on two of their more recent and visible cyber attacks from this past week, because again, breaches of the week. But the first one is actually Microsoft. Now, Lapsus has a Telegram channel. You can go follow it, as I do, and as I'm tracking all of these gangs. And essentially, I started really diving into this. I was a little behind because of the other data breach I'm going to talk about here for them. But Lapsus, talking about Microsoft, said this on their Telegram channel. Lapsus has made the source code for over 250 Microsoft projects available online in a 9 gigabyte torrent. According to the group, the torrent itself contains 90% of the source code for Bing and 45% of the source code for both Bing Maps and Cortana. Now, apparently that's one half Telegram quote, the other half from one of the articles that I'm aggregating all of this information from. But 90% of the source code for Bing, which is Microsoft's search engine and competitor to Google for the 3 people that use Bing, and 45% of the source code for Bing Maps and Cortana, another 6 people use those. So that is a huge thing. That, though, is only part of what Lapsus has essentially under its belt. Now, according to Tech Radar, they pointed to a recent statement from Bleeping Computer that got the scoop on this, that the group also has 37 gigabytes of Microsoft source code, and all of it seems to be legitimate. And to quote Tech Radar, Fortunately, it seems that the hackers didn't manage to get their hands on Windows 11 or Microsoft Office source code. That would be bomb-droppingly bad. It's one thing to hit a public search engine. It would be another thing to find all the vulnerability exploits of Windows 11 and then sit on them, meaning the researchers of the world aren't finding these. The criminals are. They're exploiting them in the wild. They're making a ton of money by breaking the world. Think Eternal Blue, if you remember that one from about 4 years ago or so, from before the pandemic. And that basically broke like 80% of the UK's National Health Service because nobody was updating. Like Windows XP, I believe, was the operating system that hit, or Windows 7. So it was a huge, huge problem. And so obviously this is a huge problem for Microsoft as well, having that source code out there, not to mention any commonalities in that source code for Bing that they may have in relation to Windows or Microsoft Office. That is a huge thing. I obviously will keep an eye on that. And the last one I want to talk about is, I think, probably one of the most fascinating stories that I've been following and personally involved in some way, shape, or form, and I'll explain that in a minute, and that would be Octa. Octa obviously is the huge identity management firm used by corporations, governments. I mean, they are a major, major player in identity management, something we all really, really need, especially in the age of stolen usernames and passwords in the dark web. And Lapsus has claimed to have gotten deep into Octa, and this is where it gets interesting. Now, Octa has responded with multiple blog posts, but also they threw a webinar with their chief security officer explaining exactly what happened. And I happened to be in that webinar live. And basically it was, I want to say, like 9 or 10 in the morning a few days ago. Now, here's what I wrote on my social media after basically the 11 or so minute webinar by Octa was over. Basically, it was their chief security officer not taking questions, just getting online, and basically to anybody that was in the audience, myself included, just talking about this, reiterating a lot of what the blog post had. I didn't think that he was necessarily giving a whole bunch of information, but this is what I wrote on my social media immediately after that, basically that webinar, and I quote myself: just sat in on the Octa webinar with their CISO. I meant to say CSO. I believe it's the CSO. I continue. The images that Lapsus put out were from an incident in late January. It would appear an attacker established a brief connection to a support contractor's computer, which gave them access to internal tools, but that user didn't have elevated privileges, so no customers or internal Octa intellectual property were affected. Seems like a major bullet was dodged. Now, according to Octa, only 375 customers may have been affected by this incident. And so I think this is actually a really interesting situation that we have going here, because obviously the CSO said a lot of different things in relation to that, and obviously that was my quick synopsis, and I'm going to talk about those things because Lapsus themselves responded to these blog posts and webinar, etc., with almost a point-by-point analysis. Now, I'm not going to go through their entire thing because obviously I'm not going to sit here and read the words of some jerk or jerks that would break into, an Octa or any corporation, but this is very interesting, and I think we're not out of the woods yet. Now, to quote some of their most interesting responses or points, this is what they had. They first put out a quote by Octa, and this was from Octa's blog, and I quote: Octa detected an unsuccessful attempt to compromise the account of a customer support engineer working for a third-party provider. That third-party provider happened to be called Cytel, for example, for reference, and that is what Octa was saying as a sub-processor. They're calling them sub-processors, and they said that in the webinar as well. But Lapsus responded to that statement, and I quote, I'm still unsure how it's a unsuccessful attempt. Logged into a super user portal with the ability to reset passwords and MFA of roughly 95% of clients isn't successful. So there you go. Lapsus also went on to say, and I quote, for a company that supports zero trust, support engineers seem to have excessive access to Slack, 8.6 thousand channels or 8,600 channels. You may want to search AKIA asterisk on your Slack rather than a bad security practice to store AWS keys in Slack channels. Lapsus is apparently claiming that because they had access to the support engineer and that support engineer had access to Octa's internal Slack, the internal messaging and communication platform, Slack was one of those things that their CSO mentioned in the webinar as one of the tools that Octa uses, or their employees and contractors use. Now Lapsus is saying, yeah, we saw Slack, and they were storing encryption keys from Amazon Web Services in Slack channels. that is a huge problem, because if that is the case, meaning they've got these shared keys sitting in Slack, and let's say they're outside of the KMS or another key management system or another secure service, that is bad form. And so obviously that's a problem. We want to make it as easy as we can to collaborate, but we also have to make it secure. And if Octa actually was doing that, that is a huge problem. And I'm not saying they were. These are the words of an attacker. These are the words of an attacker that are possibly trying to make themselves look better than they are. Nevertheless, this is something that Octa eventually has to answer to. I also quote Lapsus as well from their official response to all of this, and I quote, "Support engineers are also able to facilitate the resetting of passwords and MFA factors for users, but are unable to obtain those passwords. I hope no one can read passwords. Not just support engineers, LOL. Are you implying passwords are stored in plain text?" Now, I think that's an interesting thing. I don't think that Octa is storing stuff in plain text, but if they're sharing actual visible keys in Slack, that would be plain text to essentially anybody that is in a Slack channel that can read those Slack messages. So I'm very curious. Now, one of the things that the CSO said in the webinar is that while their utility that their contractors and internal support staff use is called super user, it is actually built with the concept known as least privilege, meaning everything it doesn't have access to except those specific things it needs access to basically support and function for users. Meaning this super user would not get essentially a support engineer from a third party or otherwise into the intellectual property, into the actual algorithms for Octa's AI or anything along those lines. But if it has the ability to reset passwords in MFA, then what other support options does it have? What other privileges does it have? And obviously, I think that's something that Octa, would have to be held accountable for, or at least give us an explanation. Now, Lapsus also took Octa to task for not alerting customers sooner, as this apparently happened in mid to late January. I believe it was January 22nd, if I recall that webinar correctly. And the world obviously just found out about this in March, like 2 months later or so, on March 23rd-ish or something along those lines. And so obviously this is not a good look for one of the largest identity management / cybersecurity firms, on the planet. So this is a huge issue. It doesn't seem like, according to Octa, they're like, well, we saw it fast, we shut it down. It was a third party. The third party doesn't have access ever to our intellectual property. So basically no harm, no foul, another bullet dodged, et cetera, et cetera. And Lapsus is saying, well, yeah, we have all of these accesses. We've got screenshots. We literally saw AWS keys in Slack, which means if they saw them, you have to assume that they copied out all of that information, which then leads to the question of what else did they see in Slack, assuming they're actually telling the truth. We cannot take off the table that Lapsus may actually simply be lying here, meaning they are trying to make this look bigger than it is. And think about it this way. When I started out talking about Lapsus, I said, look, they maybe look like R-Evil, maybe with some Russian intelligence backing, by just how deep and spectacular they've got into some massive corporations in the world. And then this last week, just Microsoft and Octa have come to light, not to mention others in the past, since they've been rather prolific the last couple of months. So if that is the case, maybe they are lying in terms of trying to basically have every cybersecurity support staff or IT support staff be scrambling at the major governments and corporations that the Octas actually run. Now think about this. If you are deciding to wage cyber warfare because, let's say, you're the Russian government against Western allies, the United States, Germany, England, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then why wouldn't you sow discord? Maybe they didn't get into Octa, but they got enough to basically put doubt there, and now you've got all of these distracted IT and cybersecurity people researching an Octa problem. So who's watching the barn? What's going on beyond, let's say, the standard security information event management systems out there? So this is a huge thing. So we can't necessarily take Lapsus at its word. They have not given us any kind of proof. Octa is saying basically bullet dodged, even though they did get in. It was brief. They didn't get access. So this is a very interesting, I think, and evolving situation. A lot of the world uses Octa to secure their stuff. Octa is a very well-known player in identity management. They are consistently one of the leaders in this. So this is a black eye to the cybersecurity community, and hopefully Octa's accurate, Lapsus is not. We will see, and I will keep you up to date here. But all of those were your breaches of the week. Just a fantastically interesting, although disturbing, unfortunately, week for data breaches. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please stay private. Thanks, everyone.